بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن سيدنا مولانا محمد عبده ورسوله رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي رب زدني علما ورب زدني علما ورب زدني علما. Dear respected brothers, friends, elders, in the previous session of Fiqh, we were discussing tayammum in terms of what it is, the definition of what tayammum is, and when can one resort to doing tayammum. So as a recap for the brothers, tayammum is a procedure which is done to purify oneself from ritual impurity. So ritual impurity here meaning something which necessitates a person doing wudu or necessitates a person doing ghusl. So ritual impurity, a person, for example, may have relieved himself and therefore his wudu has broken, so he has to do wudu again. Or a person may have had relationships with their spouse or may have had a wet dream. So in this case, a person is now ritually impure. So tayammum is a procedure which a person can do to purify themselves from ritual impurity. So tayammum can count as a substitute for wudu and for ghusl. So this is really important. So let's say a person has no water and a person has had a wet dream. So a person can do tayammum in exchange for doing the ghusl. So it counts. So tayammum is a substitute for wudu and ghusl. The key word here is a substitute. A person will only resort to doing tayammum when the person has a reason. So for example, when a person doesn't have access to water, or maybe the person is ill, extremely ill, and if he thinks that if he uses water, then the water will only increase his illness. So a person can only resort to doing tayammum when he has a reason. So tayammum is not a purifier which a person can use just for the sake of it. So what are the reasons for tayammum being allowed here? So being 1.16 miles away from water, and this scenario doesn't really occur nowadays because whenever we journey, we're not too far from a service station, etc. But let's say we're going back home, or let's say we're in the forest somewhere going on a hike, and we only have let's say we only have water for drinking, and we know that we need this water for drinking, and if we use this water for wudu, then we would dehydrate, or we would really endanger ourselves in terms of our health. So then in this case, so long as you're 1.16 miles away from any sort of water source, then you can do tayammum. So tayammum is allowed here. So being 1.16 miles away from water, we're talking about the radius. So in either direction, you're 1.16 miles away from water. Extreme cold. So let's say a person is in the middle of the Antarctic, and if he uses water, then he knows that he will fall really ill. And extreme cold meaning here fear of hypothermia, fear of his limbs falling away. What's it called? Frostbite, etc. Sickness is pretty self-explanatory. So a person is ill, let's say he has a fever or a cold, etc., and he thinks that if he is to use water, his illness will only increase. So in this case, the person can do tayammum. It's best to get this certified by an Islamic scholar, because sometimes we may think an illness is severe, whereas it may not be that severe. So another reason is wounds on most of the body. So a person has wounds on most of his limbs, and he knows that if he was to do tayammum, then he'll only increase the pain, he'll make it worse. If he was to do wudu, then he'll increase the pain, and he'll feel even more sick. Then in this case, a person can resort to doing tayammum. Fear of thirst, like I mentioned, fear of an enemy or a wild beast around the water, where the water is, and this obviously tends to happen back home. In this country, this won't really be an issue. So fear of missing the funeral prayer or Eid. So this is another scenario where tayammum can be done, because for the funeral prayer, for the janazah and for the Eid salah, there is no qada. So when a person misses the janazah salah, when a person misses the Eid salah, then they miss it. There is no substitute. So for this reason, for example, let's say a person is praying is in the funeral prayer, and he has wudu, but his wudu, whilst during the funeral prayer, his wudu breaks. So a person can do tayammum in this instance and quickly rejoin the funeral prayer, purely because if he is to go to do wudu, then by the time it comes back, etc., the funeral prayer would have been finished. The same thing can apply for Eid as well. In terms of having wound on most of the body, so there's just a bit of explanation to this, and I'll read this and I'll explain it. So if one has wounds on his body, yet his uninjured limbs are more than his injured limbs, he must wash the uninjured limbs and wipe the wounded ones, as long as wiping them does not hurt him. So in the previous slide, we spoke about how having wounds on most of the body is one of the scenarios where tayammum is allowed. So what if a person has wounds on parts of his body which when you add them up together don't account up to being most of the body? So for example, let's say a person has quite a deep gash on his arm, just on his left arm, right? So that's clearly not most of his body. So in this scenario, a person will wash and do wudu. So he will wash the rest of his limbs, and when it comes to just the arm, he'll either wipe over it with a wet hand or a wet cloth, etc. And if this is too hard to do, and if a person does this and he feels that his the illness or the limb will get even more ill, then in this case a person can completely leave out washing it, no wiping it. So a person can just leave it out and do the rest of his wudu as usual. So that's why it mentions in the second paragraph, otherwise he may leave those limbs, neither wiping nor washing them. One may not, however, wash some limbs and perform tayammum as well. So you can't wash some limbs and then perform tayammum as well. A person can't combine both together. So a person either does wudu, washing the limbs that he can wash, and wiping the limbs that he can't wash. And if he can't wipe those limbs, then he leaves them out. So this is only in the case where a person has wounds which when added up don't total to most of the body, and we're talking about those limbs which are washed in wudu. So when a person has wounds on those limbs which are washed in wudu, if they add up to being most of the limbs that are washed in wudu, then in this case a person can resort to doing tayammum. However, if they don't add up to being most of the limbs, then a person has to do wudu and wipe those limbs that are injured. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, moving on with the new content then, inshallah. So with what materials is tayammum permissible? So tayammum may be performed with any pure substance of the earth, such as dirt, sand, antimony, kuhl, which we put in our eyes, limestone, stones, or dust, even the dust on clothes. So there is a rule of thumb here to keep in mind. Whatever becomes ash or melts by being burned or heated cannot be used for tayammum. So for example, you can't do tayammum using trees or plants or anything organic, to be honest. You can't do tayammum using metals, gold, whatever kind of metal, glass, etc., etc. So that's a rule of thumb here. Anything that melts or turns into ash when it is burnt, then you can't use that material to perform tayammum with. So this leaves a lot of materials, to be honest, that still can be used for tayammum. So for using soil, unbaked bricks, any substance that has dust on it. So for example, even let's say you have this wooden bench here. If there's dust on this wooden bench, then you can use the dust on this wooden bench. You can't use the actual wooden bench because that burns and it turns into ash. But if there's dust, any material that has dust on it, you can use that dust to do tayammum. So hopefully that's clear. In regards to the procedure, how do we perform tayammum? So in tayammum, the intention is necessary. So in wudu, you brothers hopefully remember that the intention is a sunnah. In ghusl, the intention is also a sunnah. However, in tayammum, the intention is a fard. So if a person, let's say a person for some reason or the other, he enters a room that's really dusty, and because of that somehow, he ends up, touching the dust and then wiping it off his hands and then his face and his hands. If he does this without an intention, then his tayammum won't occur, right? It won't count. So making the intention is absolutely necessary. What kind of intention do we make? So we make the intention to remove the state of ritual impurity. So a person can make the intention to to be in the state of purity, to be in the state of to be in the state that you can pray salah, right? So make intention to remove the state of ritual impurity or to pray salah. This is really important. Second thing, how the second step of doing tayammum is to strike the earth once and wipe the face, and thereafter strike the earth again and wipe both arms up to and including the elbows. So these are the fara'id, you could say, the compulsory actions in tayammum. There are sunnah actions, inshallah, which we will be speaking about in the coming session. However, if a person was just to suffice on the what I've just mentioned, so making intention to remove the state of ritual impurity or to pray salah, thereafter is to strike the earth once with both hands and then wipe the entirety of the face. And after doing that, strike the earth again with both hands and wipe both arms up to and including the elbows. If a person is to suffice on this, then his tayammum will be complete. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the ability to act upon what's been said, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all the ability to perform all our rites of worship as they are to be performed in the correct manner. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Subhanallah bihamdi, subhanakallah bihamdika, ashhadu la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.